Welcome to Exceptional Learners at the Movies. This first slide, be slide 102, is a slide of Kathy Coons. And in the older editions of the text that you have, there's a little scenario about Kathy Coons. She's a young lady who has several disabilities, would like to live a normal life. And the scenario that I'll provide you in class, it's not in this new edition of your text, describes the challenges that Kathy and her parents face in trying to enable her to be normalized or to have a normal life. So I'll hand that to you or give that to you in class, and you can read about Kathy. There are three terms that are very important for you to know when we're talking about this particular section of the PowerPoint. And the three terms are normalization, deinstitutionalization, and inclusion. So when we talk about normalization, again, Kathy Coons is an excellent example. We're talking about helping those students or those people who have disabilities live as normal as a life as possible, all right? And this means possibly finding group homes where they could live. This means having access to resources that normal people would have. So normalization is a trend in special education. It's a very important term. It's kind of an umbrella term. I'll explain that in just a minute. Deinstitutionalization is the idea of moving people from institutions into more normal settings. So if we were to turn the clock back 40 or 50, 60 years ago, longer, even longer, people who had severe disabilities, mentally handicapped, people that suffered social disorders, oftentimes were institutionalized into these giant hospitals. And deinstitutionalization would be the opposite, taking them out of those settings and trying to provide a more normal setting. Inclusion fits under this umbrella of normalization. And inclusion, and you probably experienced it in high school or middle school, maybe even elementary, where we have students that have special needs or that have been qualified for exceptional learners, resources and services, helping those students grow by putting them in to a regular classroom setting. Not necessarily full-time, but giving them experiences. We've talked about this in class, where they are with all students, okay? We would call that, by the way, heterogeneous grouping, when we take students of all abilities and put them into a classroom, as opposed to homogeneous, which would mean same ability, all right? Now, when we talk about these terms, again, historically, if we look back, we'll find that oftentimes people with disabilities were institutionalized. This book, Christmas in Purgatory, you might want to take a look at slides 17 to 31, gives you an idea of what institutions look like not too long ago. I'm going to slide over here to the computer, see if I can pull up a couple slides so that you have an idea of what we're talking about. So if you go to the main slide, you slide it down. Let's say we want to take a look at slide 17. It's kind of the inside of what a room would look like, and let's enlarge that. You can see, not a very pleasant looking place. Let's go to slide 18. Let's enlarge. Type of door in such rooms where somebody can look in and check on you. Probably a lock over here. Again, looks more like probably a prison than it does a place where the needs of those with exceptional learners could be met. Let's take a look at 19 real quick. Let's enlarge it. This particular student might have some special product. Looks like there's either his hands are either bound or there's a problem there. I'm sure what that is. You can take a look at it. Again, some type of disability that he has. So you may be interested in looking at these slides and getting an idea of what it was like not too long ago to be institutionalized. The title of the book is Christmas in Purgatory, very famous book, and again you can take a look at some of the slides there. Now, again, the idea of normalization is people who believe in that view espouse that philosophy, work to try to help people with disabilities, not only students but people in general, live as normal life or to provide experiences as normal as possible. And so the question I pose to you is, what issues exist with this position? If you believe that normalization is important in schools and institutions, what are some challenges, what are some roadblocks that you might need to face in terms of perhaps resources, in terms of beliefs of other people? So I'd like you to think about that. Here are some ideas related to those challenges. When we think about that idea, maybe some obstacles, some things that you would bump up against. Number one, some groups of people with disabilities are leery about being too integrated. All right, now this is a really interesting idea. If you are a member of the deaf population, often members of that population really don't want to be integrated that much. They enjoy working with the deaf community, and they're very happy. Oftentimes they're able to accomplish goals, do things that they would like to do, and so in some instances they're leery about that idea of normalization. They like to stay in their community. They're comfortable there, and some might say, kind of leave us alone. So that's one thing you might bump up against. Another idea or thought is that some people are concerned that people without disabilities are seen as the norm to which those with disabilities are compared. So when we use this word normal, some people kind of are offended by the idea that we compare people with disabilities with people that are so-called normal, all right? And don't believe that we should be having those types of comparisons. The third idea was determining how certain groups, such as disabled athletes, will compete. So you have issues. I think just the last Olympics, the person who ran had well, I forget what they call them, but special things. He didn't have any feet, so he had like a special prong on his foot and like a blade, and he competed, was able to compete, but those kinds of challenges arise in sports and in other areas, right? So what are some reasons for why we would want to embrace or support this idea of inclusion or normalization? Number one, well, I would like you to think about that. What are some reasons why you think it would be important to do this? And maybe just get a piece of paper out and jot down some of those ideas. We'll talk about these in class. I don't have a slide in terms of the reasons, but I think after chapter 1 they probably would be pretty apparent in terms of why we would want people with disabilities to become part of normal society. And if you ever want to do something interesting, just go on the web and type in famous people with disabilities. You'll be surprised at the amount of talent of people that have had disabilities who have been extraordinary inventors, musicians. You can go on and on and on. So that might give you a clue to that answer. Now, oftentimes when we think about students with disabilities, we kind of think that they're kind of isolated, they're out there on their own, but oftentimes parents who have students with disabilities are very, very strong advocates of their children, as they should be. I know in my work in Citrus County in Florida, there was a very active, a very strong group. There was a group that advocated for gifted children, parents of gifted children, very, very strong involvement in the school system. Disabilities, strong parent group of students that had disabilities. So these are some things that these groups offer. Now these groups may or may not be connected to a state or national organization, but oftentimes they get together informally. They might have coffee clutches, they might meet at school board meetings, but they have an informal network where they can kind of keep each other apprised of what's happening in the school system. So number one, they just provide, these types of groups provide opportunities for parents to talk and to help each other through challenges, all right? Number two, they can provide services regarding, or services and resources that are present in and outside of the school. Oftentimes in these groups, you'll have one or two people who are very, very knowledgeable of resources and of special education law. And so they help inform parents, and then parents in turn can become advocates for their children in the school system. They provide a structure for obtaining needed services. Eunice Shriver in Special Olympics would be an example of somebody who has organized a group of individuals to help. Some of you may have even participated in the Special Olympics. I think if you click on this, you'll be able to see some additional information here. Oftentimes, people that work within the school district sometimes become frustrated with these groups. And I'd like you to kind of think a little bit about why they might cause frustration. One of the reasons why is these types of groups are very, very knowledgeable. And so if a child is not receiving the services through their IEP that they should, these groups are pretty aggressive. And sometimes they'll hire an attorney. Oftentimes they'll go to school board meetings. They will come together and they will advocate for additional services. They'll question. So sometimes the relationship between the parents and the school board or the school system is sometimes a little tenuous, but most school systems try to work very, very hard with these groups. Okay, we're going to skip this slide. And I want to go a little bit into legislation and litigation of special education. Now, some of you, I've had some students in the past that have been history majors, and they get to be about a junior and they figure out, you know, I really don't want to be I love history, but I really don't want to be a history teacher. I think I really want to be a lawyer. But I really like kids and I really like the field of education. So sometimes I'll sit down and sometimes I'll say, I really like the field of special education. So sometimes I'll sit down with those individuals and I'll say, have you ever thought of becoming a lawyer for special education? Okay. So school boards have special attorneys that have an expertise in the legal area of special ed. State departments of education have lawyers that have an interest and have a degree and are able to practice law in the area in the field of special education. So this is a very interesting field because there's a lot of oftentimes a lot of litigation, a lot of lawsuits that center around special ed. So we're going to talk a little bit about the legal part of it, and there are some laws that are important for you to know. Not a lot, but 3 or 4 that are very major. Number 1, Individuals with Disability Act. We call that IDEA for short. And this was passed in 1975 and then updated in 1997, updated in 2004. Continues to be updated as trends and things change. You'll see this law continue to be revised. So this basically guaranteed children to have a free and appropriate education. If you remember the Forrest Gump clip, you'll remember that his mom went to the school board, went to the principal and asked if Forrest could go to the regular school, and he said no, he needs to go to the vocational school down the street so he can learn how to change tires. You were allowed to do that back in those days. You were allowed to deny students access to regular education, but not with IDEA. You can't do that anymore. Americans with Disability Act, the idea that all individuals, even those with disabilities, should be treated equally. They have equal civil rights. This is in terms of employment, transportation, public accommodations. So a good example of that is on campus here. If you take a look at the building across from Clague, there was not wheelchair access into that building until this past fall. And if you look as you get ready to go into that building, if you look to the right, you'll see that somebody had built a wheelchair access route. So if they hadn't done that, they would have been in violation of this act and potentially could have been sued by someone who wanted access to that building. Okay, so that's an example. No Child Left Behind, you're probably familiar with this because many of you lived through this bill, this act, and this was the act that resulted in a lot of the testing that you were involved in middle school and high school. Still heavily influenced our education today, but basically it said that students with disabilities have to pass same type of standards as regular students. It also mentioned that teachers have to be highly qualified. In the past, if you were a history teacher and school starts and they didn't have enough teachers to teach math, a principal could say, hey, have you had a couple courses of math? Yes, I have. Okay, well, how about you teaching this math class? Now you can't do that. You have to be certified in a specific area, and you must, if you want to move into another area, you have to show proficiency. You have to take a test. You have to pass state requirements in order to do that. And that's for the good, that ensures a quality education for all. Okay? So this is just a little practice slide. I provide a definition. See if you can kind of name the legislation associated with it. Okay? So when we talk about IDEA, that's the umbrella, that's the big one. When we're talking about students with disabilities, these are the components or the pieces of that legislation. Number one, first of all, identification. That all school districts that receive federal money must work at identifying those with special needs. And we're going to talk more about that in Chapter 2 when we talk about response to intervention, RTI. Every child with disability must have a free and appropriate education at no cost. All right? In other words, you can't deny somebody or you can't charge them extra money if they have a disability. This goes into a whole other area about how we finance, how do we address the needs of students who are blind or need to have special equipment? How do school systems afford that? But we'll talk about that also at another time. Due process. So I am a parent of a child that has a disability, and I sit down at the IEP meeting, and I feel that my child needs something in addition to what they currently have to help them. It might be an aid, okay, which costs money. So school board or school may not be, they may not feel that my child needs that extra individual. And so if I wanted to as a parent, I could enter in what we call due process. I could sit down, we would have both sides would present, kind of like a court hearing in a way. We would sit down, both sides would present their information, and you would have an arbitrator there who would decide whether that my child would or would not need an aid or someone to help them. So this doesn't happen very often because most of the time schools, districts, and parents can come to some type of agreement, but if they can't, parents that have students with special needs can go to this idea of due process. Okay? Least restrictive environment means that we're going to place the student in an environment that best meets his needs. It may not necessarily be a regular classroom, but IDEA ensures that we look at that idea. Individualized education plan, we've already talked about that. IDEA says that every student with disabilities must have an individualized education plan. We'll talk more about what that plan looks like in Chapter 2. But those are the key components of IDEA. Okay. The intent of IDEA is to give, again, students a free and appropriate education, and the primary instrument, what drives the train on this, is the IEP. Okay. And these are the things that the IEP ensures: that the student, number one, has been carefully assessed. We've talked about that you don't put students into the program, you don't give them a label until you have checked, assessed, make sure that they need those services. That there's a team of professionals and the parents, that they work together. That's another thing that's really important in terms of special ed. It's just not the teachers working together, it's the teachers and the parents. I think we saw the absence of that when we read Juanita Pope. 3, that the goals and objectives on the IEP for how the student should be doing, usually they update that. Well, they update the IEP about every 3 years, but usually there's progress meetings, sometimes 3-4 times a year with the parents to make sure that the student is on track. And that's where that data piece comes in, where you have those graphs and charts so you can see what kind of progress the child is making. Now, this Americans with Disabilities Act, the second big piece of legislation, has to do with providing individuals with equal opportunities in terms of employment. Okay, so just because I'm in a wheelchair does not necessarily mean that I can't do a particular job. So it protects people that have disabilities when they want to go apply for a position. It makes sure that transportation, public transportation, buses, trains, those kinds of things can accommodate people with special needs. Public accommodations, restrooms, those types of things, sporting events that'll accommodate people with special needs, and also in the area of telecommunication, the use of phones and computers and those kinds of things. I know that when I was a principal, we had a parent that was deaf, and through an organization, I was able to obtain a special machine that parents could use to communicate. And so, again, I was attempting to comply with this act. Okay. So, in terms of legislation and litigation, these are some issues, some challenges. When we're dealing with the field of special ed, nothing is ever very clear cut. There's always kind of a challenge or an obstacle often to face. Number one, earlier intervention. Financially, it's very difficult, but everyone knows that the earlier you can identify people with special needs or students with special needs, the better you can serve them. So being able to do that is a challenge, because sometimes the assessment instruments are not refined enough to be able to pick up a disability for a child that's 3 or 4 years old. So how do you determine whether or not someone who's 2, 3, 4 years old, if that's a disability or whether it just might be a developmental issue? So that's kind of a challenge that people have to work through. There's oftentimes a tug of war between what the federal government thinks is best for people with disabilities and what the state thinks. So you have that type of tug and pull in terms of legislation. Again, in the early days, special education, public education was a privilege. All right, now it's a requirement. Here's an interesting issue. Sometimes parents sue school boards because they don't want their child identified as special ed. So a child comes in, it's very evident the child has special needs, but the parent does not want that label and will not provide those services. Sometimes that's a problem. Or the opposite may occur. Child may come in, may not have a disability, but the parents would like those special services. And sometimes lawsuits arise from that. All right, the Hudson versus Raleigh was just a court case. Again, I'll give you a copy of that. It's a parent who had a child who they felt needed a special an aide to work with them all day, and the court found that the child was getting a free and appropriate education with the services that were already existing. So they ruled against the parent. But again, those rulings can kind of go both ways. One thing that you may not be aware of is that they have something called an individual family service plan. In other words, there are allowances for parents who identify if there is a child that has a disability as early as the age of 3. You can do what we would call, very similar to what would be a family IEP, where agencies would work with parents and they would develop a program for a young child. And oftentimes schools now will have services where parents can kind of bring their child in for a couple hours a day at the pre-K level, and it might be a speech therapist, it might be a physical therapist, where very young children can get those services within their school. That's think about why that might be a good thing, especially in your neighborhood. Where the child gets used to the school environment at a really early age, gets familiar with the teachers. The teachers are familiar with the child, so by the time the child is ready to go into kindergarten, even if they continue to have disability, there's already that community of support for that child. So most people don't realize that there is a plan for young children. Okay? So let's go down to our last piece here. What's our perspective on the progress of special education? Well, if we take a look at progress, again, in the past, it was to receive special services was an exception. Now it's a right. It's a given right. Parents and children now have legal rights. We're not too long ago, even when I started teaching, the parents didn't really have those rights, or they weren't aware that they had those rights. They didn't have the organizations, the structures to be aware of it. We've got some laws now, IDEA, ADA, that can help and provide opportunities and minimize handicaps. The current focus is on prevention and early intervention, as they should. Continue to make breakthroughs in those areas in science, in terms of ways that we can, using technology to help people at earlier ages. But it always continues to be a struggle. It's never easy when we're working in this particular field. As we mentioned at the very beginning, there's a lot of, it's not really black and white, there's a lot of gray. Okay? So a question just to pose, I want to pose to you based on what you know about special education. Is there a reason for hope, and why or why not? The rest of this PowerPoint has to do with checkups. And again, if you look at underneath the slide, you're going to see the answers for it. So I hope you take the time to do this review. I think it'll be helpful for you when you get ready to take your test. And this is sort of what we would call a mastery learning type of approach. I think there's also another film clip if you'd like to see. And then don't forget your chapter checkup, or I believe it's a study, like a study guide with some answers. So hopefully that will help you.